Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today, our special guest is John Ropiequet. He is an attorney, a historian for the Northeast Illinois Council, and the author of an illustrated history of Boy Scouting in Glenview and Northbrook from 1919 to 1945. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
So this project, was this how you began in scouting?
Well, how I began in scouting was as a Cub Scout in 1957 in Highland Park.
So you started from the ground up.
I could go on, but you know, I'm still active with our scout troop there, and I tell people that I've had a 62-year scouting history, all in the same room, which is the basement of the Presbyterian Church.
Oh, that's a wonderful beginning.
Yes.
No, I don't think anyone can beat you in that kind of record setting.
Actually, there's a guy in Wilmette who's 98 years old and has been continuously registered. I have not. Since the late 1930s. I've made use of him at times.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
I think there's another book to be written.
Well,
or
actually,
maybe source of many books.
It features into the Glenview Northbrook book. We may get to that.
All right. So how much time did you expect it to be working on this one? I know you are an author of several Makajuan books.
Well, I wrote this one about Makajuan, 3-4 years ago. I've been doing research for better part of 7 years, I guess. It's a hobby, okay? And fortunately, I'm retired, so I have time to do this, because what's involved is looking at microfilm of local papers going back as far as they go to see what I can find. I started this at the Highland Park Library just to see, I wonder what's there. One thing led to another, as often happens. Certainly that's happened in my legal career. And I ended up, since you can actually make copies of all of these things, this is about 8,000 newspaper items for the papers in Lake County. This is about 8,000 from the papers in Cook County that I've gone through. It's about 12 papers altogether, going from Mount Prospect up to Waukegan and out to Evanston, of course. So I'm still working. There's more to come.
Yes. Well, from what I read of your book on this illustrated history, that there's just such a part of so many people's lives.
Yes. Well, scouting is very important to a lot of people, certainly to me, and I wanted to simply tell people what I found. So I've got all of this information. I summarized all the things so I could make use of it. This is actually something I did in college many years ago at Johns Hopkins, doing research into Philadelphia newspapers at the time of the Revolutionary War. It was all on microfilm, but all I had were 3x5 note cards to put notes on. Now you could make a copy of the page, and then you can sit down and make a Word document to summarize what you've got so you can find things. So that's what I've been doing for the past few years. And then, of course, I want to write it up once I see how things fit together.
Tell us some of the typical traditions of Boy Scouting that is still happening now, maybe some campfires, or what did you see in the evidence and the pictures?
Well, you know, I've been affiliated with Scouting for the past 25 years as an adult, which is different from doing it as a boy.
Yes.
Very different, because you're at the other end of the telescope. What I saw were themes. What's different? What's the same? I've been doing fundraising for a lot of different organizations over the years, so I got into how did they pay for it?
Yes.
What's the fundraising that they did?
My involvement too. I've been a mother of a scout. This fundraising tradition, I also learned much about how the Greens, the Boy Scout Greens, has a much longer history than the popcorn sales.
Right. Well, you know, back in the day, and what I'm talking about in Glenview and Northbrook particularly is back in the 1930s, into the 1920s, late 1920s, they had a fund drive every year, which meant that people went out and they knocked on doors and they asked for money. And it was both the adults and the scouts who were doing that.
They weren't selling anything at the time.
They weren't selling
Yeah.
anything back then. That came much, much later.
Yes.
Certainly after I was a scout, you know, this organized popcorn sale. I don't know if you're familiar with popcorn.
I
Sure
know.
you are.
I'm a popcorn colonel.
Okay,
for my
you know
troop,
what that is all
156.
about.
Yes, but the Greens, they said they used to sell full Christmas trees.
Right.
And they would set it up for people in their homes. They
Well,
don't just carry it. Yeah.
There's all sorts of ways to raise money, and that's one that gets the scouts involved. Having the scouts be self-sufficient financially has always been a theme, really, from the earliest days, starting in 1910. So how did the people in Glenview, for example, start a scout troop that survived? Because they didn't always survive.
Yes, yes.
We had to have a committee of adults, and you had to come up with enough money to pay for equipment and so forth. And so that's how it got started. For example, I have a picture from the book of a guy named Fred Rugen. You may have heard that name.
Oh, he's definitely part of Glenview history. Yeah.
Right. So he was in charge of fundraising, and I have a picture of him with one of the scouts who towers over him, a guy named Frank Appleyard, who looks like he must be 6'6". He was like 15 or 16 at the time, and he was out there raising money, and they have a shot of him in the Glenview paper and a similar shot of a Northbrook scout with their people in the Northbrook paper. And that's how they did it. It's different now, and I want to go into all of that, but the word popcorn is a key there. You're familiar with that one, and it's an important part of putting the thing together and making it work and making it permanent. One of the things I've found is that over the years, scout troops form, especially in the earliest years, because an outdoorsy guy gets a bunch of boys together and they go out. I mean, that's what they do.
Yes.
They may or may not have a uniform. There may not be any other organization. And then, let's say, like in Deerfield, it was a guy who was home on summer vacation from college. I have a picture of him, actually. This is my Deerfield book. This guy was in the class of 1912 at Deerfield Shields High School, a year ahead of my grandmother. So this picture actually is from Grandma's yearbook.
Wow, that is
so
close to local history. So how were you, when you were writing this,
Yes.
were you very aware that you were dealing with something that was very much part of local history?
It's a matter of discovery. I've been astonished at the amount of material that connects personally to me as well as to the community. My grandma was living in Lake Bluff at the time she was in high school, took the North Shore line down to the school. The class president, she was the class secretary, the class president came down from Lake Forest. He's featured in these books because he was in the original Lake Forest Scout Troop in 1910.
Wow.
Wow.
Yes. And
So I mean, I see all of these connections, and I want to tell people about them. And then with the help of the local historical societies and libraries, it's amazing what they have sometimes. Sometimes there's nothing.
Yeah.
I started at Highland Park. I asked, what have you got? Well, they gave me a folder. It had 3 pages in it. That's it. That's all they had. I went to Kenilworth. I said, what have you got? Well, he brought up some great big document boxes like this with photo albums from the early 1920s to the early 1930s that their scoutmaster took and put into photo albums and labeled. Not everybody does that.
Definitely, that's a big.
It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, and a big help, a boost to your research because you actually connect the names with the faces, and that's a big help.
The pictures are really, really important, which is why I emphasized illustrated history when I was trying to figure out what do I call these things. The Glenview and Northbrook one is the 10th volume I've done. So I've covered all of the North Shore communities out to Libertyville, which is, I think it was called West North Shore back then, as was Glenview.
Wow. So
Each
these
time
people,
there's more
yeah.
to find.
So you probably, personal experience, John, that you felt much more connected to these people when you see
Oh,
their
yeah.
faces and where they go, what kind of activities they put on for these young
Yes.
young men.
I was talking to a friend who lives in Lincolnshire, grew up in Northbrook. He took a look at the book after I put it together, and there's a guy in there named Edwin Giese. He said, "I know him. He lived across the street from me."
Wow.
This is a picture from the early 1930s when he was much younger, of
Yes,
course.
so he probably didn't even think of him as
Yeah.
a young man. Now that he's older.
Well, I'm
retiree.
sure he's gone at this point.
Yeah.
But especially in Highland Park, once I get into the early 1950s, these are people I know.
Yes.
So it connects on a very basic level. Now I'm getting into Evanston now with my research. I got some of it for this book up here.
I imagine there's more people that direction.
Well, it's a whole nother world as far as scouting is concerned, because it was separate from the rest of the council until 1969. They had their own council starting in 1915, very organized, and they put things in the paper regularly
Oh, then you
from
have,
then on.
yeah, you have a journal to work with.
Exactly. So I'm still working on that one. I'm up to the middle of 1920 in my research there, and there's all of this stuff to discover because, I tell people my ancestors came from Evanston.
Now you say that your book, this is for the Glenview and Northbrook one, you ended at 1945.
Right.
Well, tell us why, because
You have to stop somewhere.
well, because after 45, aren't you inundated with much more material?
That's what I was afraid of.
Yeah.
What I have been doing is to get into the oldest history first. The only one that I've done that's gone past 1947 was for Highland Park because I wanted to see what was there. Once you get into the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, you're looking at a weekly paper that's 100 to 160 pages long every week. That's a lot of microfilm to look through page by page to see what's there.
So would you say that is the height of scouting, the membership at that time?
Yes, I think the figure is 1969 was the very peak of membership, maybe 10 million.
Whoa.
Yeah, now it's about 2 million because an awful lot of things have happened.
Right. 10 million nationwide?
Nationwide,
Okay,
right.
Yes.
And also in our area too.
Yes.
That
You've been
was
very strong.
Yeah, very strong.
Scoutmaster.
Yeah, once you get into World War II, for example,
Yes.
they had 94% of the eligible boys members of scouting. 94%. Wow. It's the penetration rate is much lower today.
Yes, of course.
But
yes.
there was nothing else to do, and
There's
everybody,
no competition with it.
everybody who wasn't old enough to go into the armed services became scouts. Is how it happened. I think Girl
So the
Scouts probably
tradition.
had the same kind of thing happen to them.
Yes. And
In the post-war era, it was a different level, let's say. Very high percentage of boys became Boy Scouts into the 1960s, and then it fell off considerably after that.
yes, and there is just such a the type of tradition and bringing up young men that this was so part of, right?
Yeah, well, that's really been the attraction all along. In the earliest years, between 1910 and 1920, there's a lot of references to the Boy Scout movement. And it really was a movement because word got out that there was this thing called Boy Scouting, and people wanted to do it.
Yes.
So like in Glenview,
Being outdoors,
it started in 1919. Now, You've been to the Glenview Club, haven't you?
Yes.
Of course you have, and you saw the Boy Scout fountain.
Yes, yes.
This is from the dedication in 1919 that's in the Glenview History Center, and they have things there which I made use of, and I'd never seen this before. I thought, wow. The thing is, this was the dedication July 4, 1919. Scouting didn't start until later that year in Glenview when a bunch of guys got together and say, let's form a scout troop.
Yes.
Now, it wasn't a matter of getting a charter from the national organization. There wasn't a council to organize things.
Yeah.
And so they had a scout troop for a while. And then the guy who was the scoutmaster, which is what you have to have, moved. No more scout troop. The scouts were still around, so when a little bit later somebody said, let's form a scout troop, and they got somebody else to come in as scoutmaster, they had a scout troop again. Then that guy left.
On and off.
So it was kind of intermittent. Same experience in Northbrook and many other places too, which I mention in the book. It's until the council was organized for the North Shore at the end of 1926, there was no overarching organization to keep things organized.
Yes.
And one of the things they did was to start up new scout troops in the various towns. And Glenview was among them, and Northbrook. They started troops right after they formed, that's like about 1927. And there's been scouting more or less continuously since then, although not all of the troops survived.
Of course,
yeah.
I think in Glenview, there's 4 troops.
At present, right.
Yes, at present.
Now, there is, for example, Troop 55.
Yes.
There was a Troop
That's
55 in 1927, but that fell apart in 1938.
I see.
For the same kind of reason.
So 55, isn't that the OLPH one?
Well, because they started up a year again as Troop 55, same number, and that's the one that's here today. The period that I looked at through 1945, there were a couple other troops that started and stopped. There was Troop 53 in Gulf. Now, that's not a real big place.
Tiny,
Still, it's not a big place.
Right.
But they had a little scout troop there, which was about the size of the one in Glenview, Troop 55, which means 9 to 12 scouts, not a big troop.
Yes.
Compared to what you have today.
Right.
So the other ones started later. Troop 57, Troop 156, and the other one.
That's the one we have, 156.
Yeah.
So John, tell us a little bit about the writing and the putting together of this material. Are you part of a writing club where someone can help you edit or organize just by yourself?
Well, I've been writing and editing for over 50 years at this point. I started in law school as an editor of one of the law reviews at Northwestern, and I've been doing it more or less continuously ever since. I've published over 100 law review articles. I've been editing a survey for the American Bar Association for the past dozen years.
So you come with a lot of
So
background.
I know how to do this stuff.
Yes.
I know how to put stuff together, and I have that rare talent of being able to self-edit. So I write something, and then I say, no. And then I rearrange it, and I can do it better. Although most of the time I've gotten to the point where I can do a first draft, and the last draft is going to look a lot like it because I've got it organized, and it's just a matter of playing with the words and moving things around a little bit, not a lot.
Yes, and nonfiction is a different type of writing. You're just trying to, like a newspaper, you're trying to get to the who and where and what.
You are, and this is similar to that. You know, they say that newspapers are the first draft of history. That's actually true with what I'm doing, because all of this, and I've got it footnoted as to where it comes from. This is the Glenview and Northbrook book. One thing I did, which some of the people on the history committee look askance at, is I put footnotes down to show this is where it came from.
Yeah, the source.
All of these articles
References.
that I have coded and numbered. That's where the information comes from. Oh, this is Mr. Geese, by the way, right here.
I bet, John, your books are going to be very useful for many people who are genealogy historians or who are looking for that person that they're writing about.
If they're looking for someone in Glenview, they can look at this book, which is in the Glenview Library, as well as the Glenview History Center. Similarly with the other ones, because I've made a point of making copies for the libraries and historical societies in the area as I go along. So they're there as a reference. If somebody wanted to actually get a copy, the place where I have them printed will make you one copy if you want. It's not inexpensive, but you know, it can be done. So it's there as a resource. Now, in terms of finding a name, because I've done genealogy too.
You have,
Yeah, it's you'd have to read it to find the name.
Right, right. You
As
still
opposed
have to
yeah,
dig
there's no
for it.
index that's
Yeah.
going to give you names.
Yes, and that would be too much. There's a different focus.
I'm not an indexer.
Boy, have you received any readership response?
Some. What I do with these is I have a couple of email distribution lists that's maybe 250 people or so that have indicated an interest. So I put them on the list. And then I send all of these out to them. So once I do a new one, I'll get it out to everybody unless they tell me, take me off the list, which does not happen very often. Some people have expressed admiration or thanks. Most people, I don't know if they read them or not, frankly, because I don't get much feedback. But I'm not doing it for them, I'm doing it for me. I want to get I just want to pull it together and get something out there.
Yeah, and the Northeast Illinois Council, I think it has, the value is just going to grow as time goes by. When we really think about the people and the connection we have to pre-World War II. It's going to, I mean, even World War II, as time goes by, it feels farther and farther from us. But we need the connection to our, to our ancestors, to our neighbors' experiences.
Yes. Well, this is something that I want to be a public service, let's say. I've got all of this material, and I want to do something with it, and I want to make a permanent record of it so that if somebody does want to find it, it's going to be there in the public library. If somebody wants a copy of their own, I'd be delighted to email them a copy. All I need is an email address.
What is some lessons you've learned from this experience, John? Does it just make you want to do more, like your Macajron books?
It's somewhat addictive, I guess.
Yeah.
My wife might call it OCD.
Yeah, you have a passion.
But I like projects. This is my 10th year of retirement, and I keep coming up with things to do in the form of projects. Not just this one, but at this point, I have a legal treatise that I'm doing a 4th edition of as a co-editor with 14 sets of chapter authors. This is something that's been going on in our profession since 1984. And we're going to do an improvement. In 2014, we put out a 1,700-page treatise. In 2018, we did a 900-page supplement to it. My goal is to get the whole thing put back together and under 1,600 pages.
Wow.
We'll see.
Yeah.
And then another project, which was due yesterday, is 13 articles that I edit for an annual survey, and I've done this for a dozen years, one of which is mine. And my co-editor and I work away on these things because they come in like this, and we need to get them down to like this in terms of page count, because we have a maximum that we cannot exceed. So it's an interesting process.
So John, how does your connection to Glenview change after this research on the book?
Well, I know a lot more than I used to. Let's put it that way.
It's humbling.
Glenview was one of those towns out there from, I've lived in Highland Park much of my life, and I'm kind of Highland Park centric, I would say. And I've not had occasion to visit Glenview too often, except to, we had things at the Palladium, let's say. And then I went to a partner's funeral at OLPH. But I haven't had that many connections to Glenview until I started getting into this stuff. And then vistas open up when you go through issue by issue of the Glenview paper and look at stuff, even if I'm not looking for a scouting item. For example, I'm thinking high school. Where did these guys go to high school?
Yes.
Well, Glenbrook North was founded in the 50s, I think. Well, I found out there was a Northbrook High School before that. And then some of these guys, because that was a 3-year school, would go to Deerfield Shields for a 4th year.
Wow.
Or this guy, I mentioned Frank Appleyard, I found the picture, went to Evanston High School. So that's what they did. This was a little farming community back in the 1920s and 30s.
Far apart.
It's very different today. I mean, I put in the numbers of, just because I was curious about how big were these towns back then. Put a little chart together from 1910 forward, and you're talking about maybe 500 people or 600 people for the towns from Glenview up to Deerfield back then. Very different from where they are today.
Yes, very different. Well, John, I'm sure your book will bring you many friends, because that's how books connect us. So do you have any advice for our writers out there?
Well, I'm not sure that I would give you good advice, except that if you are writing, just keep doing it. That's simply what I've been doing. I learned how to write in high school many, many years ago. That came in handy when I had to write things in college. And then when I got to law school, I did a lot of writing because I worked on a law review, and that's what you do. As a practicing lawyer, I've had to write legal stuff, which is very different from this sort of thing, to say nothing of fiction. There's a guy named Scott Turow who's a famous lawyer and writer, and he chose to do that. I'm not into mysteries. My wife is. So I'm into history. I always found that interesting. And you just follow through on that. And at some point, which was post-retirement for me, I started writing this stuff down after doing the research that was necessary to give me the material.
I think it's a positive way to give back to the community as well.
Yes, I think so. This is history that nobody else would ever find, because the process of coming up with it is extremely time-consuming and laborious. It's like, when I used to interview candidates for Johns Hopkins who want to be pre-meds, and I said, you really, really, really have to want to be a doctor to go through that. The pre-med curriculum. They invented it. It's rigorous. Be prepared. And
that is a Boy Scout motto.
Well, we're supposed to bring things back together.
John, thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you. Join us next time on Off the Shelf.